I'm thinking about my story from last month about Shlomo Mansour, who was the oldest hostage currently being held in Gaza. As a young child, survived the bloody Iraqi Farhud. He went on to live another 70 years in the kibbutz. Then at age 85, was grabbed in his pajamas and violently shoved to his car and driven into Gaza on October 7th. I get emotional when I think about this guy. I'm sorry. It's like, it really affected me. Like talking to his daughter and his grandson, like this buff kid who's like a personal trainer now, talking about how his Saba, his fondest memory is building a SpongeBob SquarePants doll out of wood with him in the workshop. It was just, it got you, you know? My name is Joel Chaushu, and I'm the Quebec correspondent for the Canadian Jewish News. I think these stories are worth telling. We can do that with your help. Visit the cjn.ca/donate to support our work. You'll get a quarterly magazine and a tax receipt to boot. What's not to love?
Hello, I'm Ellin Bessner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Thursday, January the 9th, 2025. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News that's made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky Gluskin Charitable Foundation. For episode number 13 of our recurring series called Honourable Menschen, when we take a look at the lives and legacies of 5 prominent Canadians who passed away in the last 2 months, we'll talk about a celebrity chef and radio host, Marty Galin, Dr. Ron Weiss, who had wanted to be a professional musician, but instead spent his professional career performing nearly 60,000 painless vasectomies. Ethel Taylor, who at 92 years old turned her love of crooners from the 40s and 50s into a popular radio show she hosted until nearly her 100th birthday. Muki Baum, born in Israel with cerebral palsy and deafness, who raised nearly $1 million to fund treatment for other disabled Canadians like himself, and Donald Carr, the CJN's longtime former president. Carr was himself a former British journalist, and he kept his hand in the profession and had bylines in the CJN while his day job was founding and running one of Canada's top Jewish law firms, Goodman and Carr, until its demise in 2007. Carr also had to preside over the shuttering of the CJN back in 2013 and the resurrection. CJN's Heather Ringel has interviewed family and friends of our 5 honorable mention, and she joins me now.
Hello, nice to see you.
You were very busy at the end of the past year.
Sadly, yes.
Like every single day you had some very important community person who passed away. And we had a lawyer, one of CJN's most ardent supporters, board members, the CJN's Donald Carr.
I think everybody knows that the Canadian Jewish News is a not-for-profit company. Nobody is a proprietor. We have always looked upon ourselves as if we were, quote, trustees, unquote, for the community, and nobody on the board of directors gains financially or in any other way.
Tell us about Donald Carr, died at the age of 96, November the 18th.
Donald Carr had a 75-year legal career with Goodman and Carr. His wife described him as he was really Mr. Jewish Toronto, and he sat on the board of every organization locally and nationally, as well as being a fantastic mentor to so many young lawyers. He, of course, was married to Judy Feldcarr. She was his second wife, and in fact, they met through their kids.
Tell us that story, because it's a beautiful love story.
It was such a nice story. She had lost her husband very suddenly one year, and Don had lost his wife from cancer. She'd been ill for a while, so I guess it was 1977, and Judy Feldcarr's son said, there's another kid in the school like me, and neither of us we're both missing a parent. And you know what? His dad can put up a badminton net. And apparently Donald Carr's son said to Donald Carr that his friend had a single mother. So they kind of got together, the badminton net was put up, and things really went on from there. And he was also very supportive, of course, of her career, bringing more than 3,000 Jews out of Syria and rescuing that community. He was very quiet, in the background, very well spoken. In fact, he came to Canada. He was born in Leeds and grew up in Cheltenham in England. But he came here after the war with all intentions of being a journalist. That was his goal. He had written for a Young Zionist magazine in Britain during the war and came over here to live with his uncle, who persuaded him to go to Osgoode and become a lawyer. So it seemed very serendipitous that he ended up doing so much for the Canadian Jewish News. And I know he also contributed articles, which was it was a real love for him. So
I know that the two of them were sort of the it couple for many, nearly 50 years. And he, besides saying Mr. Jewish Toronto, maybe tell us on the national scene what Jewish organizations he fronted and advised.
Firstly, he was the chair, and he was honored by the Negev Dinner. He was on the Canadian Council for Israel and Jewish Advocacy, United Israel Appeal. And actually, in Israel, he worked with Bet Hatfutzot and with Haifa University. He started Maison Canada, helped set up One Family Fund, which helps victims of terror in Israel. So really just so many things he was involved with. In his legal career, he could have sent juniors. His specialty was wills and estates and wills and charities. But he could have sent juniors to deal with his clients. They were longtime clients, and obviously they would often need him at the very end. But he would be rushing off to nursing homes to visit them when they needed him. And in terms of estates, he would be like dealing with children who were fighting and upset over the wills. And he was really felt a lot of his purpose could be to make shalom in these families and bring them together so there wasn't so much upset. And he was very good at that. Very calm, just a very nice, a mensch, and a good guy.
We're going to speak about another personality who everybody in Toronto, in the Jewish community and non-Jewish community, has probably seen in front of United Bakers or fundraising, and knew Muki Baum. He was a beloved soul, and he passed away when he was 64 years old, just December the 6th.
A big part of the fundraising is done by Muki Baum himself. Now 50, he's lived with cerebral palsy and a severe hearing impairment his whole life. He reads lips and uses a computer to speak.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I think it's interesting, of all the obituaries that I've done, I've never received so much feedback as I have from this one. It is just the whole gamut. People who I didn't think would know him. A friend of mine who lives at the Manulife, I told her I was working on an obituary on Muki Baum, and she was shocked and upset. She said he would be at Manulife. He would be raising funds for Muki Baum Treatment Center across the street, and he would come to Manulife at lunch. He would go downstairs to the Metro store and indicate what he wanted. He was very independent. His mother, Nechama, was a real advocate for him. And ironically, she had specialized before he was born, before she was pregnant, in social work for families with children with cerebral palsy. She found that it was very difficult to accommodate him in Israel because he could either be put in somewhere where there were other deaf children, but they didn't have cerebral palsy, or he would be with CP children who weren't deaf. So she decided to look around and go further. Already he was maybe pushing into his teens. And she had 4 cities on a list to explore: Toronto, New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And she came to Toronto first. And the thing that she noticed here back in the day was that people would put out their fingers at a pedestrian crossing, and cars would stop. And at traffic lights, cars would stop. And she thought, this is a great city for Muki. He can be independent. She wanted him to be able to live his life fully. And as soon as he got here, she said she had to adapt because he wanted to go on the subway. He was on the bus. He was going everywhere. So obviously as the years went on, he was all over the city raising money for Muki Baum Treatment Center, which she started in 1979. It's actually morphed into something. It's called Aptus Treatment Center now, but it's for children with dual disabilities, everything from autism, cerebral palsy, whatever it is. They have specialized programs for them. And Muki raised somewhere between $750,000 and $1 million for them. And
how did he do it? Where did you said he went all over the city? How did he get around?
So Muki was in a wheelchair, and he would be in front of United Bakers or down at the Manulife Center or across the street in front of Holt Renfrew. He was able to navigate in the wheelchair in Toronto because we are so accessible. And he would engage with people, and he was very charming. He had also a something like an iPad before the days of the iPad to communicate. And he just emitted this joy and happiness, and he would explain what the center did and who they were. And I think that often one person would see someone engaging with them and become a little bit less fearful, because people had, even back in the day, there was a real stigma and people were a little afraid of anyone with a disability. So he
did make people uncomfortable, but then it also was so amazing that he could raise that much money. I didn't know that. Because he had like a cup. Like, it wasn't, the way we are now where you donate online and everything. Like, he literally physically raised that money, dime by dime, nickel by nickel.
Yeah. And he had a very full life. He was very artistic. I
remember meeting him I'm sure it was at the JCC, and he was doing, I don't remember what he was making, but I remember seeing him there.
I spoke to someone who had done a pottery, not a pottery class, because he knew how to make pottery, but they were making pottery together at the old Koffler Arts Center at the JCC.
That's right. You reminded me.
She just had such a great story. She said there were 3 of them in the class that worked together every week in the studio. And she had one of the third person was a woman from Montreal who constantly complained about Toronto and how much she hated it here. So she and Muki would be just writing notes to each other. And Muki would come up with these incredible pieces of pottery. And one day he decided he wanted to go on the potter's wheel, which you're on a tiny stool, and he has a disability. And this woman said that it was just hysterical. Like, they both were just laughing to get him onto the stool and for him to create. And they just had so much fun. And he made fun, like, he was self-deprecating, and it was just such a great guy. So
the sad thing is I see that he outlived his mom. She passed away 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So where did he live? Do we know?
I know that latterly, I believe he lived with his dad in Bathurst Manor, but he had lived independently, I believe, for a while, quite a while. So, and he had a lot of friends with different things. As small family. I believe he had a brother who lived with his dad, and yeah.
And while we're on the subject of mobility and mobility scooters, let's talk about Marty Galin, because most people who have heard of Muki will probably also be hearing about Marty. He's kind of a little bit older, 10 years older, but a fixture in downtown Toronto, fixture on the radio, fixture in Jewish Toronto, and just also a soul, a beloved, bigger than life personality. Think about a white, frizzy afro hairdo, big red frame glasses, and scooting around Toronto, even on the subway, in his mobility scooter in later years. So tell us about Marty Galin, and of course, Avram Rosenzweig, too.
A lot of you probably don't know, the gentleman standing back there, we were Marty and Avram, the boot guys. And we were that's the guy with the beard right there. But we had an amazing time. We would bring food for everybody before the show. And we were 10 years on radio, and then 5 TV shows, and we started developing food products.
Yes. Well, Marty, I guess for those of us who remember the days before TikTok and social media, he would have been a social media influencer, TikTok foodie, if, in this day. But in 1995, he was sort of a bit of an out-of-work actor and looking for something interesting to do. And he got onto the idea of doing food reviews. And I think part of it was he just loved food. He loved eating out. He partnered with his friend Avram Rosenzweig, And they ended up hosting and becoming kind of very familiar in Toronto for Marty and Avram, the food guys. He had amazing guests, not all, everything from chefs to people like Harry Belafonte or Jose Feliciano coming to the studio. The Galloping Gourmet, for those of us who remember, one of the original TV chefs in the 60s, and he was kind of iconic. And they would talk about everything. They did food demos on the show, which I think latterly started to get a little bit out of hand. I think they did a demo and at that time even invited homeless people to come in to have to sample the food, which was great. But eventually I think everything got a little bit out of hand.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute because you brought up the word homeless, and I need to tell our listeners about a story which some of you may have seen in the local newspapers. But about 2 years ago, Marty was nearly killed while he was riding his mobility device at a subway station. I'm pretty sure it was College Subway, by a homeless person who toppled him on the street, and he was left for dead. He was bleeding. It was an attack by someone with mental illness, and he was covered in blood, gasping for breath. It took him 6 weeks to recover in hospital. He had a heart attack at the time. And apparently, according to a write-up I read in the Toronto Sun, a Toronto police officer told him at the time, don't let this attack define your life. So what do you think he decided to do? He invented something called Superlicious. And because he had a lot of contacts, as you mentioned, in the food business with the spaghetti factory and the Loblaw and the Burger Shack, he decided they were going to have a Valentine's Day homeless Superlicious, where they would feed a homeless person a hot meal and a side of love and bagels, because he thought that that's the sort of root of the mental illness problem, is that they're hungry. So I love this. He told people, I'm going to skip revenge and go straight to forgiveness. And I just thought that is such a beautiful anecdote about a man who also created the world's largest salad in Scarborough and gave it away. So that's another whole story. And one other thing that you mentioned, how he was an innovator. He created a character based on his beloved mother, Chicky. Even one of his dogs was named Chicky after his mom. And I think some of her recipes, I'm not sure if it was butter tarts, but they got sold commercially. I remember Avram and Marty had like an ice cream for Passover that you could eat. And I used to buy it. And Marty, of course, made, I think it was butter tarts named after his mom, or with his mom's recipe.
Yeah.
I also read that they did a circumcision live on the radio. Is that true?
I recently wrote a story about the editorial landscape of campus newspapers, how many student newspapers throughout the country are rejecting pro-Israel perspectives. It also focuses on what students are doing about it. This was an important story that I think highlights the cultural war that's taking place on campuses right now as students continue to adopt an anti-Israel and, in some cases, anti-Jewish perspective. My career as a journalist actually started at a student newspaper years ago, so this was a full circle moment that's allowed me to revisit my roots and see how much has changed in a post-October 7th world. My name is Mitchell Konski. I cover campus life and education for the Canadian Jewish News. If you want to support this work and everything else that we do at the CJN, please visit thecjn.ca/donate. And if you're Canadian, you can also get a tax receipt.
Now, you mentioned Marty was on the radio. The late Ethel Taylor, who died November 30th. She was 99 years old. So let's do this in her honor of her 100th birthday, January the 8th, 2025. She would have been 100 years old. Tell us about Ethel Taylor and her nickname.
So Ethel Taylor was known as the oldest radio host in the world. She hosted, she was known as E.T., Ethel Taylor, and she hosted a show called Martini Music, which was on a station 88.7 The Bay in Muskoka. She'd been doing it since 2016, and she had a real passion for music from the 50s, 40s, 50s, the crooners, Bing Crosby, Steve Lawrence, Edie Gourmet, and she actually was very good friends with Vic Damone, who was an actor and a singer in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Okay, for all you young people, this is why we have Siri and Alexa and ChatGPT. Look them up.
Hi, I'm E.T. I'm over 93 years old, and I'm Muskoka's oldest radio host. Please join me this Sunday night from 6 to 8 p.m. for Martini Music on Hunters Bay Radio, the Bay, 88.7. And together we will listen to the music I love. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a roll.
Of course, the question is, how did she meet Vic Damone? Ethel Taylor's husband, Sidney, decided to take her to Las Vegas for a trip. And back in the day, in the 60s, a lot of husbands and wives traveled separately for security, safety reasons. And Ethel got to Las Vegas a little bit early and found out that Vic Damone was playing there. She was a huge fan. And in fact, again, back in the day, there used to be listening booths in downtown Toronto where you could go into sort of a record store and listen to music. She didn't have wasn't able to do it at home at the time because this was expensive technology. So she would listen to Vic Damone. So she got to Vegas, she went to the show, and she was all glammed up, absolutely gorgeous, had a great time. And as she was leaving, again, she's still waiting. Her husband was supposed to arrive that night. She saw a cardboard cutout of Vic Damone in the lobby of the hotel, or just outside of the room he was performing in. She grabbed this cutout and took the cardboard cutout out to her bedroom, tucked it in under the sheets, and when her husband arrived, he came into the room and found this cardboard cutout in bed, and they had a good laugh about it. Vic Damone's manager found out about this and that she was sort of a super fan and insisted on introducing them, and they just hit it off. The couple hit it off with Vic and his wife. Ethel's husband was a dentist, and an exceptional dentist in Toronto, Dr. Sidney Taylor, and he became Vic Damone's dentist. So Vic would come to Toronto to have his dental work done. They hung out together. They went to 2 weddings of Vic Damone's. So they really just had this great relationship over the years. And interestingly, one of the other things about her, moving a little bit aside, this is a bit of an aside to her time at the radio station. She met her husband when she was 15.
She was at Central. She went to Commerce in Toronto, the other Jewish school, not Harvard.
And when he went off to war, she ended up doing a lot of volunteer work at Sunnybrook, and she ended up really getting a role in helping soldiers when they came back from the war, helping them adapt, and came up with educational recommendations. And at the time, Sunnybrook's K-Wing, Kilgore Wing, which is their veterans wing, was just forming. So she really had an impact on Sunnybrook and on the kind of programs that they provide. I know that Ethel Taylor's daughter, Shauna Lee Taylor Oppenheimer, had mentioned that firstly, when her father was a veteran, so when he died, he had a gorgeous sort of military funeral with a Canadian flag, like it was lovely. And also when Ethel was ill, she got exceptional care there because she was recognized as having contributed when the unit started. So
right. So Dr. Sidney Taylor died a little bit more than 10 years ago in 2013. They lost a son who died in 2020 at age 48. And so when her mom died, I know I watched on Facebook that she wrote that mom and dad and Dean Jordan are all together in heaven now. I want to talk to you about her career before she decided at age 92 to become a radio host. She worked for her husband, did she not, as her office manager at his office?
She did. She worked as an office manager for him. And in 2016, I believe that she'd been spending more time in Muskoka, and she took over. And there was a radio show that an actor, James Carroll, was running called Martini Music, and he became ill, and he specifically asked that she carry the show on. And she would end every show with a song called Every Time I Look at You, which Vic Damone wrote. And Ethel had actually co-written this song with her daughter, Shauna. The story was that Shauna was a really excellent pianist, like conservatory level pianist, practicing at home. And after her parents and Vic Damone went out for dinner one night, but Vic Damone heard her playing, heard the tune, and asked her if she could finish it off and put some words to it, which she did with her mother. And apparently, a few months later at Passover Seder, the phone rang and kept ringing. And Vic Damone was on the other line and said, "I want you to hear this." And he'd recorded the song with words. So it was really quite beautiful.
Now, do we know? She also used to say at the end of every episode, "I'll be back next week if I'm still alive," which I love. But do we know whether the station plans to continue her show?
They have offered the job to Shauna, her daughter. So I guess we'll see what happens.
I want to end on Dr. Ron Weiss from Ottawa died in October at the age of 68. So for our listeners who read your obituary, they used to call him No Slice Weiss.
You have a procedure that takes literally minutes, is painless, has a very low rate of complication, and is the most effective form of birth control, period. Men are stepping up to the plate.
Maybe you can tell us who gave him the moniker and another nickname.
So Ron Weiss was a doctor whose specialty was vasectomies, and he brought the no scalpel, no needle vasectomy technique to Canada. He was also known as the Wayne Gretzky of vasectomies because in his life he performed 58,789 procedures. So he was very disciplined, very prolific. He was diagnosed with glioblastoma, which is the same cancer that Gord Downey of the Tragically Hip had in 2020. And he thankfully outlived his 15-month prognosis.
It's like a brain tumor, so we have to say. It's a brain tumor.
Right.
And he retired, right? When he couldn't do the work anymore, he was very tired and getting treatment during the pandemic. And so he wanted to work. This is why I say man plans, God laughs. He wanted to work till he was 70 and then retire. And unfortunately, his illness didn't allow that to happen.
And I think to your point about man plans and God laughs, his plan when he was younger was to be a musician. And he was one of those guys in the 70s who was sitting out in front of Holy Trinity Church in Toronto, busking and playing the guitar. And he was at the Toronto Free School. And when he was finished, he ended up moving to Vancouver and he wanted to study music at the Berklee School. When he got to Vancouver, he was living with his brother there, and all of a sudden he really became passionate, extremely disciplined. He started exercising. He would have the same breakfast every day, granola with blueberries and yogurt in the afternoon. He would practice 5 hours a day. And one weekend he decided that he was going to fly to Montreal, take a break. And he met his wife, his future wife, Debbie, at a party there that weekend, and his life changed. She immediately knew
un coup de foudre, as they say, love at first sight.
He knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, and he also realized that being a musician would be a little bit tough. So he went back to high school to get his chemistry, biology, physics credits. She was finishing up social work at University of Western Ontario. And then he went to med school and became a doctor and was a GP for a number of years. They were married and they had children. And by the way, they had spent a little bit of time in Israel. He had worked there once he became a doctor. So he was very passionate about Israel. And then he had a patient who came to him with this idea that he'd heard about with vasectomies, and Ron embraced this. He started doing it in his practice. It was taking up a lot of time though and energy. There's a lot of sterilization issues, so he decided to move it to his house on Clemo Avenue in Ottawa, and his wife became his assistant there and would help, not medically, but she was running the office. It was a very fun atmosphere, and they would have prizes for every 1,000th vasectomy. You'd get a bottle of wine. They give out gift baskets. It was very positive. Every day he would do 14 vasectomies in the morning. First exercise, then do 14 vasectomies in the morning, have lunch, and practice music in the afternoon. So he was very disciplined, just passionate about life. The last 4 years, he was recording songs. Unfortunately, as you said, just taken too soon. They did a tremendous amount of traveling. In fact, they would go, when they went to the Philippines and to India, he would perform like 1,000 vasectomies when he was there in the week that they were there on holiday. So it would be a work vacation as well. So
I read that he thought he was good at this because he had small hands that were good for playing guitar, so that they also were very useful in working in sort of restricted spaces. Now, if I was a man, I'd be petrified to have a vasectomy, because you would think that it's going to hurt. There's needles, there's incisions, but apparently it was literally painless. And that's rewarding to hear. But then, do you know how he tried to calm his patients down when they're lying down or whatever they're doing? Do you know what they looked at the ceiling? He put up a tranquil photo of trees from Cathedral Grove in British Columbia. So it's like this beautiful forest with the very, very tall trees. I think it's a very famous landmark in British Columbia. And his vasectomy patients would look at that during their procedures up at the ceiling. I think that's better than watching TV on CP24, no? At a dentist's office, as one does today.
Much more relaxing.
So you've had some wonderful people to profile on our latest Honourable Mention. Thank you so much, Heather, for doing this holy work. It's been great to learn more about them. Thanks so much for being on the CJN Daily.
Thanks, Ellin.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Links to read more about our Honourable Mention and women in Heather Ringel's sensitive and moving obituaries of our community leaders can be found in our show notes. Our show is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and the music is by Dov Beck-Levine. Thanks for listening.
My name is Michael Freeman. I am the director of the Canadian Jewish News Podcast Network. When we first started podcasting at the Canadian Jewish News, we had to use the boardroom, and there was this wall of huge hardcover tomes filled with back issues of the CJN print edition, the old weekly paper dating back to the 60s and 70s. And because our microphone setup was not what you would call professional, my co-host and I had to prop up our microphones on these giant books, these tomes. We were literally recording on top of history. Today, the CJN Podcast Network has around a dozen shows. We're at 2 million downloads all time. Like everything we produce at the CJN, our podcasts are totally free. There's no paywall. You can listen to everything for free forever. But we do rely on the community to keep us going. And you can help. Please visit thecjn.ca/donate to make a tax-deductible donation.